So before I come to some documentation relating to research undertaken at Treloar's, there are a handful of further materials and observations from the evidence about issues relevant to treatment, communication with pupils and parents, and issues of consent. One document we haven't looked at yet is a book written by Dr. Arenstam called Haemophilic Bleeding. Shomek, it's RLIT 40666. And we can see it's called Haemophilic Bleeding Early Management at Home. If we go on I think it's about 6 pages, Shomek. So page before that, I think. Yeah, we can see the date of publication. So it was published in 1985. I'm not entirely sure, so when precisely in 1985, or when precisely written, but clearly written by then. And if we could go then to the, just to the preface, it's about another 5 pages on, please. That's it. And I just wanted to read what Dr. Arenstam says in part here, and then look at one particular passage in the main part of the book. He says, 150 severely affected adolescent haemophiliacs have passed through the Lord Mayor Treloar College since 1973. They have been treated for bleeds at the Treloar Haemophilia Centre more than 15,000 times. Information on all bleeds has been recorded and many lessons have been learned. Mistakes were made, failures have been analysed and management regimes have been altered. This book is really the book of those haemophilic boys, for it is a distillate of the experience gained from the observation and treatment of all those bleeds over all those years. My own personal involvement began in 1977 when I was suddenly faced with the responsibility for the clinical care of 55 severe haemophiliacs boarding at the college, far from their homes and from the expertise of their own haemophilia centres. An immediate treatment strategy had to be devised, and this was based initially on the results of an analysis of the crude data available from 5,500 bleeds, which were seen and treated at the college between 1973 and 1977. From then on, we began to collect data in depth on each bleeding episode. Constant review and analysis of these data have enabled us continually to update our practice, and many of our innovations have been confirmed by controlled clinical studies. The information and recommendations in this book represent the Treloar Haemophilia Centre view of current best practice within a residential institution. I believe that extrapolation to everyday living is a valid one, but recognise that the practicalities of our approach are not always appropriate. This reservation is stressed repeatedly in the text. I should also point out, however, that best treatment is best treatment, however inconvenient. Our experience and our recommendations are on offer. It is for the haemophiliac or his advisor to balance the severity of his bleed against the urgency of his commitments and his assessment of the long-term consequences of possible under-treatment. So those are just some introductory observations that Dr. Arenstam made. The particular passage I wanted to go to is in the chapter on prophylaxis. If we just pick it up at page 106, please. We can see there the heading prophylaxis, and then Dr. Arenstam talks about long-term prophylaxis and says in the second paragraph, some haemophilia doctors put young children on long-term prophylaxis in order to prevent haemophilic arthropathy. Rather higher doses and frequency may be needed since any joint bleed can initiate the process. And then he talks about limited prophylaxis given for a fixed period of time, usually from 1 to 8 weeks. Limited prophylaxis may be given for target joints. It can also be prescribed for periods of stress, such as examinations, when bleeding may be more frequent in certain individuals. A bad patch, which many haemophiliacs undergo periodically, can be another indication for limited prophylaxis. And then if we go over the page, he then talks about single-dose prophylaxis. This is the giving of one dose of factor VIII to cover a one-off situation. This may be a high-risk event, such as a sporting occasion. Such an event may be high risk even when the haemophiliac is not playing. A major event such as the cup final could involve a long and heavy journey, a lot of jostling, a large crowd and a lot of excitement. I would always advocate a dose before such an event. There are also occasions which are not in themselves high risk but are of such social significance that a bleed would be disastrous. Weddings and examinations are obvious instances. I am quite liberal in this matter and extend my list to include discotheques, important dates and Christmas shopping. My philosophy on the whole is that if it is important to a patient, it warrants a prophylactic dose. I let him decide. And of course, whether that is an accurate characterisation of the actual approach to treatment at Treloar's will be a matter ultimately for you to decide, sir.
Well, it doesn't entirely fit with some of the evidence we've heard this week about those who didn't want to have it.
Yes, well, it doesn't fit in terms of the evidence in relation to prophylaxis. Perhaps more generally, it doesn't necessarily fit with any of the evidence we've heard about the provision of information in relation to the obtaining of informed consent. This category at our centre gets the highest doses. Once we accept that a bleed must be avoided, we can't take choices. At least double our standard dose is indicated. And then we have a paragraph, and the reason for going to this page really is because this is the only paragraph I can find in the book which refers to either hepatitis or AIDS. It's certainly the only page referenced in the index in relation to those subjects. And this is in 1985. No one could possibly argue that the infusion of a plasma product such as factor VIII for bleeding is unnecessary. The same can clearly not be said for prophylaxis. The risk of complications such as hepatitis and AIDS make prophylaxis unacceptable to some doctors and some haemophiliacs. Extensive discussion on this subject is beyond the scope of this book. I feel very strongly, however, that this is a matter you should consider after discussion with your own doctors. Even if they feel prophylaxis is indicated, the ultimate decision is yours. It can, however, be very helpful to hear the objective views of someone who is not as emotionally involved as yourself. And that, as I say, is the only indexed reference to either AIDS or hepatitis. And certainly on a skim of the entire book, I haven't identified any other references to it.
Yeah, and what this is indicating, in 1985, presumably a lot of the text prepared either earlier in 85 or late 84, is a collaborative, participative approach to treatment.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the issues for you to consider is whether the reality lived up to what Dr. Arenstam is here describing as being the proper approach.
Well, he obviously is recognising, at least at an intellectual level, that at least as far as other doctors are concerned and other patients are concerned, they should talk about it with the doctor and reach a joint decision, and the decision is the patient's.
Yes. We can take that down, thank you. Then looking broadly at the question of communication with patients, we've heard both in 2019 in the oral evidence we heard then from witnesses who had attended Treloar's and in the course of this week, evidence about what individual pupils were or were not told and what their parents were or were not told about risk at testing and so on. In terms of hepatitis and information about hepatitis, you'll recall the evidence of Nick Sainsbury talking about being told there were two types of hepatitis, the fatal kind and non-fatal kind. And you'll recall his evidence about remembering in relation to that outbreak in the mid-1970s, the red mark on the plate to identify which boys had hepatitis. There is another witness, the sister of a pupil at Treloar's, who also recalls her brother's cutlery and crockery being marked because he was infected with hepatitis. So that recollection is not unique to Nick. And then if we look at WITN 3224001, please. This is a statement from another Treloar's pupil, and if we go to the second page, we can look at paragraph 9 towards the bottom of the page. While I was at the LMT, I was informed that I was infected with hepatitis B. I was still a minor at the time. I do not recall my mother ever being told about this diagnosis. She certainly never told me she had. A group of pupils were told collectively that we'd been tested positive. We were also told that because we were haemophiliacs, we would get over it, unlike other people. So again, that maybe in broad terms again, consistent with the kind of recollection Nick described, of essentially being told it's not something for you as a haemophiliac to worry about. And that's the broad sense that emerges from the evidence overall that the inquiry has received. In relation to communication about HTLV3, HIV and AIDS, there's a range of evidence the inquiry has received. Again, some we've heard orally in 2019 and this week. Others are in the form of written statements. One witness recalls a pupil, a roommate, not returning to school after half term. People were asking what had happened and being told not to worry, that people would be looked after. Some witnesses have recalled some kind of meeting with pupils at some stage regarding AIDS, in which they were told, don't worry, only 2 people in the UK with haemophilia have AIDS. So an attempt to provide reassurance. And another witness, a mother, recalls her sons being invited to a meeting at which they were told that there was information about AIDS and haemophiliacs in America, but it was not something for the pupils to worry about. In relation to how individual pupils were informed that they had tested positive for HTLV3, the evidence that the inquiry has received and heard suggests that there was not a single uniform approach adopted. So as you've heard, there are witnesses who recall being told in a group with other pupils, being told in a matter-of-fact way, or being told essentially, you have it, you don't, you have it, you don't. There are others who recall being told on their own, by Dr. Arenstam, possibly with others. You've heard, and we had evidence this week, that there appears to have been the communication of that information over quite a long period of time, in the sense that there are some who, it appears, may have been told in 1985, but others who may not have been told until 1986, which raises the question about there being delays, given that we know that Dr. Arenstam certainly had a number of results by March of 1985, and yet evidence of possibly as much as a year or more before the individual is told. And of course, we've heard evidence this week which suggests that some pupils may not have been told at all. And you'll recall the extremely powerful evidence of John Peach in that regard about his sons. And of course, evidence which paints a picture that for the most part, parents do not appear to have been told directly by Treloar's, by the Haemophilia Centre, of their child's diagnosis. I say for the most part, there is some limited evidence of parents recalling being told themselves, but for the most part, that's not the picture which emerges from the evidence. We know from the evidence we heard yesterday that the headmaster was not involved in the process of pupils being given this information, or involved in the process of ensuring that parents were given that information. And the evidence that we have from Mr. Scott, the housemaster, or one of the housemasters, indicates that he was not involved in that process. So that which the vast majority of pupils recall, in other words, that they were told by the staff at the Haemophilia Centre, it seems to be consistent with all the evidence that we have. There doesn't appear to have been any consideration given to having someone there, whether parent or housemaster or someone else in loco parentis, to provide emotional and pastoral support at what must have been a horrific time. The evidence then about what support was available to pupils given this information, it is at best equivocal. Again, you'll recall Mr. Macpherson's evidence, his understanding that there was, in principle at least, a psychiatrist and a counsellor available. And there is evidence to suggest that that was a facility that was available across the school as a whole. So we have a statement from Ms. Burton, who was the headmaster's secretary for a period of time, who recalls there being counsellors at the school, but not a structured or organised arrangement in relation to the haemophiliac students for them to be seen specifically. And if we go to the statement of Mr. Scott, the housemaster...
Do we have any information as to when the counsellors began their work? Were they there for anyone at any time?
So my reading of the evidence, sir, is that there was no specific counselling facility that was introduced into the school to address the HIV diagnosis and the position of haemophiliac patients being given this diagnosis and supporting them. The evidence suggests that there was some form of broader counselling service that might have been available to all pupils as a matter of generality.
Yes. Certainly, the headmaster had a number of relatively scathing things to say about the way in which pupils were told, which he had not, assuming that the evidence is accepted, which he had not understood.
Yes.
Before hearing it here.
If we go to the statement of Mr. Scott at WITN 5314001, Mr. Scott was a housemaster at Treloar from 1981 until his retirement in 2011. And if we go to page 8, he says in paragraph 41, in general terms, I would consider the training which I received to have been fit for purpose in its time, but with the benefit of hindsight, I feel it was perhaps lacking as regards supporting those with HIV and or AIDS. In the next paragraph, clinical staff from the Treloar Haemophilia Centre attended to explain medical information as regards HIV/AIDS to staff, such issues as its means of transmission, safe disposal of clinical waste, and in particular care that had to be taken around blood. So we did receive some useful instruction, but there was a lack of training which would have enabled staff to offer psychological support to infected students. And the next paragraph, this particular requirement was beyond anything which my past experience and training had prepared me for, and I found myself ill-equipped to address individual concerns when they were suddenly presented with an HIV diagnosis and confronted with questions as to what HIV/AIDS could mean for them. So that was Mr. Scott's recollection. And then if we can go back to a document we've looked at a couple of times before, it's Dr. Arenstam's 1986 report to the region. It's at HHFT 301073. So it gives us some information about counselling and other matters. If I pick it up at the beginning, the steady evolution of this centre has been shattered by the impact of AIDS/HIV infection, which will exert a major influence on our policies for several years to come. We have had to reassess our priorities, and this report will consider only those of major relevance. The consumption of factor VIII is still clearly important, and our patient population and therapeutic policies are significant influences on this. AIDS/HIV has added considerably to our workload, and there are other financial implications related to therapy. And then he refers to the centre extending its expertise from bleeding into offering a broader service in relation to clotting. And then if we go down the page, I referred yesterday to the second paragraph under the heading AIDS/HIV, which referred to there being 43 patients antibody positive. We go to the next paragraph. He says many of our patients are now showing clinical evidence of HIV disease, and further details are given in that regard. Towards the bottom of that paragraph, he says, we're likely, therefore, to have 7 further cases of AIDS within the next year or two, and I predict 20 to 25 cases in my haemophiliac patients by 1990. There are gloomier predictions about which suggest that up to 100% of the infected haemophiliac population will eventually succumb to the virus. And again, so you may wish to contrast what Dr. Arenstam is saying there with what we've seen referred to from time to time elsewhere about saying at least saying at some stages to others, we don't know how many people will progress to AIDS. Probably only a very small proportion of people will progress to AIDS. At least by 1986, it appears that is no longer Dr. Arenstam's view. And then he continues, the bare facts do not reveal the cataclysmic impact of the AIDS-HIV problem on our haemophilia centre. The patients, their families, the haemophilia centre staff and the community around us are all profoundly affected and will continue to be so for many years to come. We at the centre have had to devise a multifaceted strategy for responding to many different situations. If we go to the third page, please, Shamik. Which have arisen, and others which will arise in the future. Naturally, there are implications for resources. And then we see a heading, counselling, in which Dr. Arenstam says this: all haemophiliac families affected or not are encountering prejudice. They need support to deal with this, and the community around needs education. Adult haemophiliacs with the antibody live a life haunted by fear. They need constant support and follow-up visits, which are now much more frequent, require much more time at each visit. Parents of children with HIV are devastated and need even more support and time. They are plagued by prejudice at school and in the neighbourhood, and the solution is to go out and educate, but this requires time. Antibody-positive haemophiliac children enter adolescence with an increasing viral load. Nature has programmed them for sexual experimentation at a time of maximal infectiousness. The counselling involved in this situation must be expert, intense, patient, and even more time-consuming if breakout of the virus from this group is to be averted. The advent of full-blown AIDS demands support for the dying and for those who will be bereaved. It is also important to realise that the advent of AIDS is not just a matter of coming into hospital and dying. It takes 3 to 4 years to die, and in between hospital admissions there are long periods when the sufferer is at home, becoming weaker and increasingly a drain on community resources. It is during these times that the Haemophilia Centre must remain involved. We cannot be seen to abandon those who we have accepted as our lifelong responsibility. And then he poses the question, who should counsel? And this may give us some insight into the availability of counselling at the school. He says, in our centre, I and a nursing sister have done it all up to now. So there's no suggestion there of external counselling or additional counselling available. The specialised nature of the haemophiliac condition makes it impossible to win the trust of the patient unless you are seen to have a thorough understanding of the primary illness. For this reason, I do not see a role for the injection of specialised counsellors into our unit. We have been allotted a social worker from the local Department of Social Work who will spend 1 morning a week at the centre. She will naturally be involved in social work with our patients, and I hope will be able to take on some of the counselling load, but obviously only a minor component. I see myself as continuing to play the major role in this area with the nursing sister. She is young and in the nature of things likely to move on in the next year or two. Continuity with the haemophiliac families must be preserved. And then there's a reference to the need for ongoing medical surveillance, for immunological surveillance, where he says, I believe it's essential to monitor the T-cell markers, and we've had to develop the technique in our own laboratories because of logistical difficulties in getting fresh samples to Southampton. This work is done by Haemophilia Centre staff, and then there's a reference to treatment and the possibility of AZT. So that's the report that Dr. Arenstam made to the Wessex region, the Regional Health Authority, in, as I say, we think 1986.
Was any part of this report asking for finance for a counsellor?
No. I mean, it's a request for continued funding, certainly. That I think is the purpose of it. If we go to page 7, actually I should have referred to this. So this provides some further information about Dr. Arenstam's involvement. He says, I'm contracted to do 5 sessions a week, mornings at the Haemophilia Centre, 5 sessions a week, afternoons at the Department of Haematology, Basingstoke District Hospital. And then he refers to the difficulty of what he says is maintaining his commitments to the Haemophilia Centre, and he lists, amongst other things, the increased counselling commitment as well as increase in administration and paperwork consequent upon the HIV situation, and he refers to his involvement in various groups and working parties. Point 7, he describes himself as a trained AIDS HIV counsellor. He says, I've had many patients referred to me for counselling who are not haemophiliacs. He says in paragraph 8, I view the above as obligatory commitments. There are, however, other commitments which it would be irresponsible to ignore. Our experience at Treloar's is almost unique, and it is essential that it is documented. Coordinating the necessary collection of data and communicating the information must be done and is time-consuming. And then he's essentially making out a case for a further full-time consultant in what follows. If we go to the next page, he talks about predictions and future requirements in relation to funding. And so he's asking for increased funding for the laboratory, pay increases for staff, a third consultant, funding to enable centre staff to visit patients in their home, funding for attendance at education and conferences.
Now, I think you're on a page which
Oh, I'm so sorry.
not on the screen.
Entirely my fault. It's the page after that. I should have looked at the screen. So you'll see here, sir, heading predictions and future requirements. And he's setting out here what he thinks the future requirements of the centre are and what will need enhanced funding. So he refers to the laboratory, and then the heading medical staff underlined in relation to pay increases for medical staff. He refers to the need to appoint a third consultant haematologist, funding to enable centre staff to visit patients in their home, and then under the heading education conferences, funding to enable staff to keep abreast of current developments nationally and internationally. And if we go over the page, what else is listed there are all examples of the kind of conferences and meetings he thinks staff should be funded to attend, and then this reference in terms of spending and revenue. So no, there's no financial case there put for the appointment of a counsellor to the centre.
No, but I suppose the context in which he is saying, I do all the counselling, is saying that AIDS is taking up a lot of his time. It inevitably imposes demands. Those demands are real. Please, therefore, appoint somebody else to share the load.
Yes, absolutely.
Not the load of counselling, but the load of
the
work,
general haematology
allowing me
work.
to do what I have to do to fulfil my obligations to those who are my patients who have suffered from HIV infection. So there is a motive
Yes.
for for upplaying his own role and downplaying the role of others, but it still doesn't entirely explain, unless he's simply not mentioning it deliberately, the absence of any reference to counselling being available through the school.
Yes, you're right, it doesn't mention it at all. And I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that there was any kind of specialist counselling available through the school in any event, and you've seen what Mr. Scott had to say.
No.
But you're right, it doesn't refer to that.
So one way or the other, I have to make sense of what the headmaster told me yesterday as against this contemporaneous account, albeit with the motive, and Mr. Scott's account.
Yes. And then, in terms of information being provided more broadly to parents of pupils at the school, as opposed to information about children's diagnosis being provided to individual parents, Mr. Macpherson referred, I think, to a letter sent out by Dr. Tomlinson to try and reassure the parent cohort as a whole about the risks of AIDS. It may be he was referring to the document at RLIT 40663. And certainly the minutes of governing body meetings that we had do refer to Dr. Tomlinson writing to parents. This is a letter, the date is not clear in the top right-hand corner. as you'll see, and zooming in doesn't help either, unfortunately. It's on the 19th of September, 1980-something, but that's the best I've been able to do. But it says, "Dear parents, you will no doubt have been concerned as we have by the treatment of a haemophiliac boy in a Hampshire school and the interest in this that has been aroused by the media." And you'll recall Mr. Macpherson not having any particular recollection about media problems. "As you know, we've always had haemophiliac boys at this school so that they've been able to have immediate treatment and also continue their education. They have always integrated well with the children with other handicaps. We have been aware that the treatment the haemophiliacs have had has now led to the risk of infection with the virus which causes AIDS, and we have taken this very seriously. We have watched the results of all the research being done and have been in touch with all the leading specialists in this field. We are being extremely cautious and are assuming that any haemophiliac boy could be a carrier of the virus. Even if this is so, the chance of any of them eventually developing AIDS is very small," and there's a contrast with what Dr. Arenston was saying in his report to the region. "The infection is extremely difficult to spread as the virus dies immediately it is outside the body. We are confident that the precautions we take at the college make it impossible for the virus to be passed on to any child or member of staff at the school. The only risk we are left with is that of close and intimate sexual contact with a possible carrier of the virus, and this is, of course, against the college rules, and we trust that the pupils will not put themselves at risk in this way. We will continue to take every care, and we assure you that the safety of the other children and the school staff is our first concern. We also have a responsibility to ensure that the haemophiliac boys should be treated in a humane way and not unjustifiably ostracised. If you want any further information about this or details of the precautions being taken, please do not hesitate to contact me or the headmaster, either by telephone or by arranging to come and see us." And we can see the letter is from Dr. Tomlinson, the school medical officer. So that as appears on the face of it, was a letter seemingly designed to reassure the parents of all the pupils at the school that they should not be concerned about HIV being passed on amongst pupils at the school.
Just as you've been talking, my mind is still thinking about the counselling question. Do any of the statements we have from those who were actual pupils or those who are the parents of or family of those who are pupils who are no longer with us, say anything about them having any form of counselling which might meet the description?
I don't think so. There are entries in medical records and there are correspondence that refer to the nursing sister, Jane Kershaw, the nursing sister at the centre, having conversations with one particular pupil about diagnosis and its implications. In terms of any form of specialist counselling or counselling other than through Dr. Arenston and the nursing staff at the centre, I can't recall anything. I'm just going to see if Ms. Fraser-Butland's got any recollection either. No, hers is the same as mine from the statements that we've read, and I think we've read all the statements the inquirers received, which describe attendance at Treloar's either directly from a pupil or from a family member. We've not detected anything which refers to any form of external counselling within the school or elsewhere.
Yes, thank you.
And we've, just to get a sense of what the nursing system is talking about, if we go to TREL 40222_033. This is a letter, so this is a number of years on now, since September 1989. But it's a letter from Jane Kershaw, the Haemophilia Centre, to a nursing sister at the Oxford Haemophilia Centre. And it's about a couple of specific pupils who've recently left Lord Mayor Treloar College and will be reverting to the care of the Oxford Haemophilia Centre. It refers to Dr. Wassev writing to Dr. Matthews about the clinical aspects of their care, and then what you might regard as counselling aspects are then touched on in Jane Kershaw's letter. So she says in paragraph 4, in relation to one of the boys, that he's fully aware of his HIV status and all its implications. Many discussions have taken place on the subject of HIV and AIDS, and also regarding relationships and related emotional issues. And she refers to him as harbouring quite a lot of anger about the situation, aggravated by some negative experiences. She also refers to having had some contact with the parents of one of the boys. And in relation to the other boy that she's discussing, there is a discussion about whether that individual should be told his HIV diagnosis. So it's apparent from what's set out in this letter and over the page, and I'm not going to go to it because there is quite a lot of detail about the individual family, even though it's redacted. So no, we won't go to it, thanks, Chairman. We'll just go back to the first page. But there's a discussion which makes clear that there's one particular pupil who hasn't been told their HIV diagnosis, albeit it is described as being at the request of the parents. So that's, we've referred to that because it's a relatively, it's one of relatively few pieces of documentation which show those kind of discussions, the kind of discussions that you might think counselling would encompass, taking place. But it's with the nursing sister, and as we see, it's rather later on in the course of the 1980s, rather than at that particular point in time when boys were being told their diagnoses and might have needed maximum support.
Yes, thank you very much.
Then just a couple of further documents. If we go to TREL 40365, these are the extracts from minutes of a governing body in February 1986. So you asked yesterday if we knew when the first reference to AIDS was in governing body minutes, and the answer is we don't appear to have all the governing body minutes, and so we're still checking to try and find out what the position is in that regard. But if we go to the second page, I looked at one paragraph from this with Mr. Macpherson yesterday, but if we perhaps just look at the rest of the discussion under the heading AIDS. The headmaster commented that the correct inference to draw from the minute on this subject from the last meeting was that although very few of the haemophiliac boys carrying the AIDS antibodies would develop AIDS, this meant that at least one would do so at some stage. So again, there appears to be something rather different being said here to what we see in Dr. Arenstam's report to the region, which is a much bleaker and one might think more realistic assessment of the situation.
Yes.
Then there's a reference to advice from Dr. Arenstam about the risks of transmission. So a pupil actually suffering from AIDS posed no greater danger to other pupils and staff in the college than any of the pupils carrying the AIDS antibodies. And the advice being that it's the person with AIDS who might be, in fact, at risk of being infected by others with opportunistic infections and the like. So
certainly at this stage, he wasn't taking the view that the AIDS antibody might be protective.
No, that's right. And then we can see what's said to be a meeting that had taken place between the headmaster and senior staff to consider the action that should be taken once it was determined a pupil was actually suffering from AIDS, as opposed to merely carrying the antibodies. And there's reference to a 3-stage process. Stage 1, when a pupil had been identified as actually suffering from AIDS, he would not be asked to leave the college. Information on his condition should be restricted to the parents and headmaster and to nurses and senior staff who needed to know. Again, that's not necessarily consistent with what we saw yesterday about the school staff or the headmaster not actually knowing which individuals were infected. But in any event, stage 2 is described as when a pupil is suffering from an opportunistic illness exacerbated by AIDS. He'll be nursed in the college sick bay provided he's not too severely ill. And stage 3 was when a pupil becomes so weak as to be unable to benefit from further teaching, but not before she would be transferred to their home or hospital for permanent nursing care. So that's, well, perhaps if we just look at the bottom of the page. think I referred Mr. McPherson to the suggestion that the parents of pupils were aware of their son's infection. Obviously, we've got evidence to the contrary. But then we can see a reference to the public relations problems that might occur. And if we go to the top of the next page, we see identified in the second paragraph a further reference to public relations. So we see Dr. Whitfield emphasising that his view that the college's policy and procedure was exemplary, but suggesting it might be advisable to make contact with the health authority for advice on how to handle the public relations aspects of these matters. The evidence in relation to pupils being told about the hepatitis C diagnoses that the inquiries received is much more limited, possibly because a lot of those who've given statements to the inquiry received their diagnoses after they left Treloar's and were receiving their diagnosis from their home haemophilia centre. So the information is rather more limited. We've got a statement where a witness recalls being informed by Dr. Wassef about infection with hepatitis C. And his recollections, he was told it would kill him, but Dr. Wassef wasn't sure how long that process would take, so essentially told it was something serious. Another witness recalls their parents being told at a meeting in Treloar's of the infection with hepatitis C, but the gist of that was, well, your son will be fine and just to get on with life. Again, another recalls just being told of hepatitis C, but not really being given any further information at all. And there's one set of documents which does provide an indication of a delay in a patient being told their diagnosis. So we've got a test result from mid-1990 and evidence which suggests that the test result was communicated in around mid-1991. So a delay there of a year. And then just a couple of documents more broadly on treatment for hepatitis C. If we go to TREL 40313_066. This is a letter of the 12th of July 1991. May have referred to it yesterday, I'm not sure in the context of, if we look further down the page. In the last paragraph, there's a discussion there about non-A, non-B hepatitis. So we can see there's a reference to a liver examination, and Dr. Wassef says, I explained to him that his antibodies to HCV, non-A, non-B. Not quite sure why in July 1991 the term non-A, non-B is being used rather than hepatitis C. But in any event, the letter continues, and that almost all haemophiliacs got that through factor VIII transfusions in the past. I've explained the significance of this and the possible long-term effect. And Dr. Wassef describes passing that information on to the pupil's mother and providing a copy of a Haemophilia Society bulletin article. And then bottom of the page, Dr. Wassef says we'll be seeking advice regarding management of this condition following the recent publications on the value of interferon in some cases of HCV infection. A tentative reference there to the possibility of treatment with interferon. And then if we go to TREL 40137_046. This is a letter from the 20th of November 1995. It's from Dr. Wassef to Professor Arthur at Southampton General Hospital. It's not specifically in relation to a Treloar's pupil. It's in relation to a catchment area pupil. But again, it provides some indication of the broader picture in terms of availability of treatment. Although I am aware of the ongoing dialogue between yourself and Dr. Arenstam regarding arrangements to see all our haemophilia patients with antibodies to HCV sometime in the near future. This is a one-off patient whom I'd be most grateful if you would be kind enough to send an appointment direct to see you as soon as you possibly can. And then there are details given about the specific patient and their concern about the consequences of hepatitis C. So it tends to suggest that in terms of referral for treatment and advice for the hepatitis and the liver care more generally, as at November 1995, that was still a matter in discussion as between Dr. Arenstam and Southampton General Hospital, rather than there being by that point in time any specific arrangements to seek expert hepatology or care from a consultant physician or the like. If I then just deal with an issue which has recurred throughout the oral evidence this week, and that's the question of consent or informed consent to treatment and to testing. You obviously have heard the oral evidence both from 2019 and from this week, and we've referred in our written note to a number of other witness statements and documents in this regard, drawn from records, correspondence, and so on from the Treloar's material. It'll obviously be a matter for submissions in due course and for your judgment in due course, sir. But the evidence, certainly, that we have seen to date would tend to suggest, not by a slim margin but overwhelmingly, that parents were not told, or at least there was no system or process in general operation for telling parents of risks of viral infection, and the same true in relation to pupils. That parents were not given details about or even core information about their children's treatment at Treloar's for haemophilia. And you'll recall again the evidence of Mr. Peach, not aware that his sons were being switched from receipt of the NHS Lister concentrate to multiple American concentrates, and there are similar examples in the material that we've referred to. Parents not being told that AIDS-related investigations or tests were being undertaken, or that pupils were being monitored for the stigmata of AIDS, and likewise pupils not being told that. And then in relation to hepatitis, and with the exception of some evidence of parents being given information in that 1974-75 outbreak, the evidence suggests parents were not systematically told if their sons were believed to have been infected with hepatitis. There's no particular evidence to suggest, again, any systematic approach to informing parents about non-A, non-B hepatitis or the significance of abnormal liver function tests. Pupils appear to have been given limited information of the kind described. They might have been aware of friends going yellow, but hepatitis essentially portrayed as something that was not something that they needed to be concerned about. And then the evidence, again, that we've seen tends to suggest that neither pupils nor parents were told that children were being tested for HTLV3, and not having been told, were obviously not in a position to consent to that process of testing. And then, of course, the evidence suggesting that parents, for the most part, were not told the outcomes of those tests. And certainly we've looked in the course of the week at some examples of medical records, and we've looked at where there have been in 1983 examinations being undertaken for immune system disturbance, looking at lymph nodes, weight loss, etc., etc. So we've seen examples of those kind of examinations being recorded in the notes. We've seen multiple examples of letters being written to the home clinician, both in 83, 84, 85. What we have not seen are any records which record the communication of the diagnosis to the patient. So we do not see, for those witnesses whose records we've looked at, either for the purposes of their oral evidence or for the purpose of examining the material more broadly, entries which say, saw X today, informed X of their HTLV3 test result, counselled X about their HTLV3 test result. So that kind of information simply does not appear to have been recorded, at least in any of the records that we have. In terms of the impact of everything that I've referred to, everything that we've heard in the course of the week upon pupils, I'm not going to try and summarise the powerful, emotional, eloquent evidence that you've heard, because I would not do it justice. But everything that you have heard, sir, and read paints a very clear and powerful picture of the effect that this has had on individuals' lives. And as I say, I would do it an injustice if I tried to summarise it. So before then I turn to the question of research, there's one short video clip to play, which is just, it's a brief interview of a kind with Dr. Arenstam. So if we could play that, please, Shomik.
Haemophilia is a disorder which stops blood clotting. It can affect the bone joints and cripple the sufferer. An essential part of the treatment is Factor VIII, a clotting agent refined from thousands of blood donations. Now, in the light of AIDS, it's screened and heat-treated, and donors are discouraged if they're in high-risk groups. But between 1980 and 1985, contaminated batches of Factor VIII came into Britain from America. 1,200 haemophiliacs here contracted the virus. Of those, 66 developed full-blown AIDS, and of those, 49 are now dead. The Lord Mayor Treloar Haemophilia Centre at Alton in Hampshire is alongside a school for disabled youngsters. About 20 are haemophiliacs. Staff at the centre see 70 other patients from outside. Dr. Tony Arenstam sees 43 haemophiliacs with the AIDS virus. Counselling has become a bigger part of his job as he sees sufferers facing more and more problems as they try to cope with everyday life, like securing mortgages and life insurance. £10 million compensation between 1,200 sufferers means £8,000 each, and he says that's not enough. His patient today is a former pupil at the college, 21 years old, living in Hampshire, and newly married.
It still makes it very hard to get any sort of life assurance for me. So that means mortgages are difficult to get.
When you first found out that you were positive, what sort of things went through your mind about how it would affect everyday life?
They're just things just appear all the time, you know, it's all the time that you're thinking about that sort of thing. It's not an instant thing, you don't suddenly realise, oh no, that means, you know, I'm not going to be able to have children, something like that.
We gave it to them. We were trying to treat them, we were trying to make them healthy, and what we did was we added another catastrophe to the disaster they already live under. So they are different.
What effect has it had on patients that you've treated in the way that they're treated in society?
Well, it's been devastating for many people. They've had to go underground in many ways. They would be isolated at work if it were known. There have been problems at school. They have problems getting mortgages. They have problems getting insurance. It's a devastating problem, apart from the very fact that they have to live with the fact that they may die.
Do you think if you were given some money by the government to help you, that would actually be of any use? Or is it just the
not
stigma?
in house buying, is it? I mean, I can't wave a cheque at estate agents and say, the government are giving me this money, will you give me a mortgage now? I don't think they'll fall for that.
How much more do you think has got to be done to recognise that there is a big problem for haemophiliacs and that they will need more help in the future?
Well, I don't quite know what the terms of the current government move is, and I don't know whether it is the first step in recognising that there is a problem or whether this is their final word. So I can't really answer. This should only be the first step towards adequately compensating them.
But if this figure is true, say they get £8,000 each,
Well, they can have a nice holiday, but they can't do very much else.
so it's not enough.
No.
The date of that?
We'll check. I don't know off the top of my head. It's obviously presumably around the time of the
Of the
first.
setting up of the Macfarlane Trust?
Yes, exactly.
So it would have been sometime in 1988, probably.
Probably. It's late 80s, I would have.
But yes, or late 87, but it was the end of 87 it was announced to Macfarlane. And given the content, it sounds before the first of the Macfarlane Special Trusts,
Yes.
special payments.
Yes, we'll check. It's on, I think, the Tainted Blood website, that video, so I'll see if we can find out what the date was. So I'm then going to come to the question of research. I use that as a very general heading. What we'll see is there are references to research, to trials, to studies on multiple occasions in the documents. It is not always easy to piece together, for example, if one has something that looks like a consent form or an entry in records referring to a trial, what trial or study or piece of research is being referred to. But what is clear and what clearly emerges from the documentation is that research was regarded as a fundamental part of the work that was undertaken in relation to Treloar's pupils, really from the end of the 1960s onwards, and throughout the 1970s and 1980s. And so I'm going to refer to a number of documents which show pieces of research being undertaken, but it won't necessarily be a comprehensive whole because, as I say, it's not always easy to work out whether a document is referring to one particular trial or several trials, and if so, which ones.
Do we have an idea of the total number of studies that might have been done, or the range within which that might have fallen?
We don't really. So I'm going to be referring to a number of studies and references to a number of projects. But it was an ongoing feature, if I can put it that way. So they are studies that many of them went on for a number of years. So whilst I can't give a figure to the number of research projects or studies, what one can, I think, say is that there was always research being undertaken. If you take any one particular year or even any one term, the picture that emerges is that there were studies, trials, or research, sometimes prospective, sometimes retrospective, being undertaken.
I mean, Dr. Rainsford was specifically appointed as a research fellow, was he not?
He was, yes.
And Dr. Kirk was also, I think, a researcher.
He was, yes. That was the basis for the appointment of each of them, yes. But Dr. Arblaster and Dr. Arenstam, although appointed to undertake clinical roles, are also very closely involved, particularly Dr. Arenstam, with research undertaken at the college.
Yes.
So if we just look at a handful of general documents before the break, just to give a flavour of the role of research at the school. We go to AMRE 4011_006.
Now you're missing a
Oh, am I? Sorry,
zero.
5 zeros. AMRE 5 zeros.
That's it.
11_006. So this is an undated document, but it's from, I think, probably the first half of the 1970s, because it's about obtaining funding for the appointment of Dr. Kirk. But it also gives some background, some history in terms of the history of research at the college, and also a flavour of the importance of research. So we can see the heading Introduction. Lord Mayor Treloar College is a unique establishment since there are more than 50 boys suffering from various coagulation defects, namely haemophilia, Christmas diseases and von Willebrand's disease, in residence at the college for approximately 264 days each year. These boys usually come to the college at the age of 11 and leave at the age of 16 to 18 years. They are therefore under continuous medical supervision for 9 months of each year and often for many years. Day-to-day treatments afforded to these boys by the Treloar Haemophiliac Centre, which is under the direction of Dr. P.C. Arblaster, consultant physician. This centre was established 3 years ago and is now one of the best staffed and equipped centres in the country. There are adequate laboratory facilities specialising in coagulation under the direction of Dr. A. Arenstam, consultant haematologist, who is also associate director of the centre. The boys are kept under orthopaedic supervision by Mr. Francis J. Moynihan, consultant orthopaedic surgeon. The staff at the centre consist of a medical officer who's employed as full-time SHO in haemophilia, a medical officer of consultant status who is employed for 7/11ths of his time at the Haemophilia Treatment Centre, and 4/11ths as medical officer to Lord Mayor Treloar College and Florence Treloar School. These medical officers have the assistance of a team of sisters and nursing staff. And then we get to research. Since 1968, a research fellowship in haemophilia has been established at the college by the National Fund for Research into Crippling Diseases. The present research fellow, with secretarial help also provided by the National Fund for Research into Crippling Diseases, has set up an organisation at the college, and meticulous medical records are maintained, and that's a reference, I think, to Dr. Rainsford. If we go over the page, continues. Lord Mayor Treloar College is a large, modern sick quarters built in 1958, which provides 14 beds for inpatient treatment. It's fully equipped with a modern surgery, physiotherapy department, consulting room staffed by 3 state-registered nurses and 2 medical orderlies, all of whom have been fully trained by the present research fellow, Dr. Rainsford, in the management and treatment of haemophilia. And then there's a reference to a physiotherapist and the availability of hydrotherapy. Arrangements are such that any emergency can now be dealt with at the college. The present research fellow accomplished a great deal during his stay at the college and was responsible in part for the research on which the foundation of the Alton Centre was based. It is anticipated that Dr. Rainsford will stay in the locality of the school and continue to work part-time at the centre for the next 2 to 3 years and be paid by the Regional Health Authority. During this extension of his work, Dr. Rainsford will support the centre, complete his present research projects and give assistance to the new research fellow. The present arrangements at the college are particularly suitable for a specific type of research into haemophilia and other coagulation disorders, namely the study of the relationship between laboratory findings and close day-to-day clinical observations. It is the only establishment in the United Kingdom which can provide the opportunity and the facilities for extensive clinical trials of various kinds of treatment, which cannot at present be conducted anywhere else. A word of explanation is required about the proposed, a work of explanation is required about the proposed association of the new research fellow and project with the Oxford Haemophilia Centre. There has been close liaison between the Oxford Haemophilia Centre and the care of haemophilic boys at the Treloar College for the last 10 years and more. In the last year, this type of association has been given recognition by the DHSS by a plan to organise haemophilia treatment and research on a supra-regional basis. It's proposed that certain supra-regional centres, of which Oxford Centre is one, should be responsible for administrative duties such as ensuring an adequate supply of Factor VIII, providing a reference laboratory and teaching facilities, providing holiday support, determining the number of haemophiliac patients in their area of care and organising research on a regional basis. Alton is included in the region provisionally assigned to Oxford. In this new organisational framework, it's hoped that exchange of NHS staff may be arranged between the Oxford Centre and that at Alton, and it is proposed that the research facilities of the Oxford Centre should be available to the research fellow at the Treloar College. It is our opinion that the basic NHS organisation at the Treloar College is now such that a young research fellow could work for and obtain a research degree by working both at the college and at Oxford. The present application is for financial support of such a fellow. And then we see the heading, the research project. The research project is entitled The Promotion of Hemostasis in Patients Suffering from Congenital Deficiency of Blood Clotting Factor 8 or 9. The research will form the basis of a research degree to be submitted by the fellow to a UK university. Clinical and pathological observations made during the last 6 years at Lord Mayor Treloar College on boys suffering from haemophilia strongly suggests that the frequency and duration of spontaneous bleeding is not solely due to a deficiency of the known coagulation factors. The most important fundamental discovery concerning the diathesis of haemophilia made over the past few years is probably the recognition of factor VIII-related antigen. At present, the nature and function of this factor remains to be determined. Investigations... Sorry, this bit's rather faint. And then there's a discussion about investigations on von Willebrands. I'm not going to read all of this out, but it refers again to findings at Treloar College already published in a 1971 publication. It suggested, therefore, that we should concentrate on this aspect of research in the near future. And then if we go to the next main paragraph down, it says this: the existence of commercial concentrates of human factor VIII has led to much more liberal use of fractions prepared from large donor pools in the treatment of haemophilia. The consequences for the patients of this increased treatment are improved protection from crippling deformity and much extended horizons of possible activities. But the danger of contracting the blood-borne viruses causing hepatitis is also increased. The residence of these boys in one place provides an ideal opportunity to study this complication of treatment. The project will have two main aspects: one, laboratory; two, clinical planning and observation. And then if we go to the next page, there's a discussion under the heading Laboratory Observations. It says in the laboratory, observations will be made on the levels of various important plasma constituents in relation to the clinical state of the boys at the Treloar College, and to observe the effects of treatment on these constituents. And then there are various particular aspects of laboratory observation that are then recorded. If we go just over halfway down the page, we'll see that paragraph D refers to liver function tests, SGOT, SGPT, etc., will be carried out at regular intervals on blood samples which are collected at the time of infusions given to the boys. These samples will also be tested for, I think that's probably hepatitis B, antigen and antibody. An attempt will be made to trace the source of infection in every instance of the patients, however mild clinically. Some of the tests proposed may give abnormal results in response to conditions other than viral hepatitis, and such associations will be recorded. Observations will be made on blood samples from boys having antibodies to factor VIII in an attempt to determine the natural history of such antibodies in the patients. So those are some of the laboratory studies proposed. And then in terms of clinical studies, depending on the results of the current trial of prophylactic therapy being completed by Dr. Rainsford, and I'll come on to the prophylaxis studies, there may well be the need to hold a new prophylactic trial, and then this bit's very faint, with increased, sorry, can we just look at the very first?
Increased and more frequent dosage of factor VIII.
Right. Thank you, sir.
I think it's probably better actually not highlighted.
I think it probably is, yes.
Because it's easy to read, I'm afraid, in the original.
And then it refers in the next paragraph to the careful studies of the records already carried out by Rainsford and, not sure who the second name is, but it's referenced to a publication.
Hall, it looks like.
Looks like.
It's difficult.
And there's a reference to a publication in the British Journal of Haematology, will form the basis for comparison in all clinical studies. These records will be something to ensure compatibility with previous observations and to provide the background against which to something...
Provide the background against which to ensure the effects of treatment, to measure the effects of treatment.
Thank you, sir, to measure the effects of treatment. And then there's reference to some work on the role of tranexamic acid, and there's a suggestion that that work be extended by a controlled clinical trial. And again, there's some further documentation in relation to that. And there's a discussion halfway down that paragraph of dividing boys into two groups, one who would receive tranexamic acid for the first 3 days whenever they bled, plus factor VIII replacement therapy, and the second group would merely be treated with replacement therapy alone. And then it says at the end of that paragraph, this trial will need to be arranged so it does not interfere with any future trial of prophylactic therapy. And then in association with the laboratory study of hepatitis, clinical observations will be made of the conditions of the boys with particular attention to the possibility of hepatitis. The work on hepatitis will be coordinated with that of Dr. Krask of the microbiology laboratory at Bournemouth and with observations at Oxford. And then the last page talks about the research fellow. Should the application for research support be granted, Dr. Peter John Kirk has expressed interest in undertaking the research project, reference to appending his CV. We consider Dr. Kirk to be quite unusually well qualified to profit by the research opportunity maybe you can read the next few words, sir, but I can't, something of the exceptional facilities at the college and at the
Oxford Centre.
It will be seen from Dr. Kirk's CV that he has an excellent background for this research project. He has final qualifications in laboratory technology as a qualified medical practitioner. And then there's reference to him graduating from the University of Aberdeen in 1972, now taking his MRCP examinations. During his work as senior house officer at the Alton Haemophilia Centre, Dr. Kirk has shown great initiative, competence and responsibility and is already engaged in many of the research projects at present in progress. These include the study of antithrombin levels in patients and the study of hepatitis. It's proposed that if Dr. Kirk is appointed, he should register as a student for the degree of Doctor of Medicine at the University of Aberdeen. With every confidence he would obtain the degree in 3 years. Moreover, we're sure that 3 years of research would be particularly beneficial to the future career of Dr. Kirk, who wishes to qualify as a consultant clinical haematologist. So as I say, undated, but clearly in the first half of the 1970s, given...
well, it looks as though it's at a time when Dr. Rainsford is bowing out to become part-time.
Yes.
Dr. Kirk about to be appointed and is already working in the service at Alton. It also must be after 73, because there's reference to a 73 study in it. So it looks to be mid-70s. Also, it refers to viruses causing hepatitis in the plural.
It does, which might suggest 1974 or thereabouts.
74, 75, probably, but it's very, very difficult to give an accurate date.
Yes, and I'm not sure we have a precise date for Dr. Kirk's involvement, not least because he had some involvement in a house officer capacity already, so there were some earlier references to him. I'll check when we first see him referred to as a research fellow or assistant research fellow to see whether we can give a more accurate date. But it's roughly 74, possibly 75.
Yes.
So I'm going to be looking at a number of documents in the course of the day, so perhaps now would be a good time for a break before I start.
Yes, probably 10 to 12?
Certainly.
10 to 12.